beneath a blood-red moon. The city slept, its streets silent except for the occasional clatter of a shutter or the distant bark of a dog. In the shadows of the alleys, a figure crouched by the edge of an open cesspit, his lantern casting trembling light across the jagged stone. The air above the pit hung heavy with the metallic tang of rot, a miasma that clung to skin and lungs alike. He inhaled cautiously, a shallow breath to stave off the nausea that always came first. Then, with a groan that echoed against the walls of the forgotten tunnel, he lowered himself into the darkness, the wooden ladder creaking beneath the weight of his years and his toil. The pit yawned beneath him, a vertical tomb of muck and excrement. The surface shimmered faintly, disturbed only by his descent, as though the waste itself recoiled at the intrusion. His boots sank into the sludge with every step, sucking at leather and flesh, and he forced himself to move with methodical care. One false slip could mean instant oblivion, a plunge into the fetid depths where no one would find him until the stench betrayed the tragedy. Around him, the walls wept with moisture, and the faint whisper of rats skittering in the dark reminded him that he was never truly alone. Shovel in hand, he began his grim labor. Each scoop was a small victory over chaos, a defiance of the inevitable decay that pooled beneath the city. The stench was overpowering, a living thing that clawed at his senses. Yet he moved with a rhythm born of countless nights beneath the streets. His hands, scarred and blackened with grime, knew exactly how to tilt, lift, and fling without hesitation. And yet, as the hours crept onward, his mind wandered to the surface, to the warmth of a hearth, the comfort of food, and the eyes of those who could never see the labor beneath their feet. Sometimes he whispered prayers, muttered half-forgotten phrases to saints long dead, or cursed the city's luck in a tongue only the walls could hear. His companions were shadows. The rat that nibbled near his boots, the echo of dripping water, and the flicker of the lantern that painted monstrous shapes across the tunnel walls. Fear was constant, the terror of being buried alive in his own filth a companion as persistent as the air itself. Yet fear sharpened him, made each motion precise, each breath a measured act of survival. The deeper he went, the more the city above seemed a distant memory. Here, time did not flow in hours or days but in scoops and the relentless smell of decay. He felt the pulse of the city in the muck, in the hidden arteries that carried its waste, and in that knowledge a strange pride took root. He was invisible, yet indispensable, a silent witness to the life of the streets above. Merchants haggled, children cried, and priests intoned their prayers, oblivious to the labor that allowed their very homes to remain habitable. He felt their indifference as sharply as any insult, yet he bore it without complaint, for he understood a truth the world above could not see. Society depended on the unseen, the ignored, the reviled. Hours passed, marked only by the slow arc of the moon and the gradual erosion of his energy. Sweat mingled with filth, running into his eyes and searing his vision, but he continued, each movement an act of defiance against exhaustion. Sometimes, the ground threatened to give way, a warning rumble beneath the muck, and he would freeze, heart hammering, listening to the soft drip of water and the distant scuttle of unseen creatures. One wrong move, one misjudged step, and the darkness could swallow him whole. The pit seemed alive, testing him, daring him to falter, and in those moments he spoke to himself, coaxing courage from memory and muscle. As the first pale fingers of dawn stretched across the city rooftops, he finally hauled the last heap of waste to the edge, muscles screaming in protest. The ladder felt steeper in the light of day, the world above both cruel and comforting. He climbed, each rung a testament to endurance, each breath a victory over the despair that clung to the pit below. When he emerged, the stench hit him anew, but so did the warmth of the morning sun, illuminating the grime that coated him like armor. The city awoke around him, blissfully unaware of the toil beneath its streets, of the man who had faced the pit and survived, unbroken in spirit if battered in body. He stood there for a moment, chest heaving, hands trembling from exertion, and gazed back into the shadowed maw of the cesspit. In that gaze was a quiet acknowledgement of his own resilience, of the invisible thread that tied him to every street above. And though the city would never speak his name, he had left his mark in the only way that mattered: survival, continuity, and the silent dignity of labor performed without witness or reward. With each step toward the distant hearth of his modest home, he carried the weight of the pit, yet also the pride of the unseen. The people would dine, the streets would remain walkable, and the city's heart would beat, oblivious yet sustained. He was alone, yet he was part of everything, reviled yet essential. And as he vanished into the rising sun, a whisper of the pit clung to him, a reminder that beneath the city's grandeur, life endured through those who embraced the darkness so others might live in light. The mist clung to the marsh like a shroud, thick and unyielding, curling around gnarled reeds and stagnant pools. In this twilight world, the earth was soft, sucking at the bare feet of the man who ventured deeper with each step. The cold was relentless, crawling through his bones, threading into the marrow itself. But he moved with a quiet purpose, each footfall a deliberate incantation against the marsh's whispered threats. The water lapped at his calves, dark and viscous, hiding the mud and the treacherous roots beneath. A solitary heron lifted in the distance, its wings slicing the fog, a ghostly specter against the waning sky. He paused, knee-deep in the water, and let his hands drift along the surface, stirring the sediment, coaxing the creatures he sought from their hidden burrows. Small, black shadows wriggled along the water, slipping into the skin he offered willingly, drawing the life of his own blood with a tenacity that mirrored his own. The sting was sharp, immediate, yet fleeting, a reminder that every gift exacts a price. Each day he risked infection, gangrene, the insidious march of fever. But fear was a luxury reserved for the weak. He had chosen this path, as generations before him had, a keeper of traditions older than the castles that loomed miles away, a man who held death and healing in the same trembling hands. The rhythm of his work was hypnotic. A plop of foot in mud, the hiss of a leech, a sigh of wind threading through reeds. He moved in silence, but the marsh spoke to him in subtle languages. The croak of frogs like distant drums, the sudden splash of fish fleeing unseen predators, the faint scent of decaying vegetation carried on the breeze. These sounds, these smells, these textures were the pulse of his world. And yet, beneath the monotony, there was a tension that never abated. Every shadow in the water could conceal a snake, a hidden hole that would swallow him, or the creeping rot that came with forgotten cuts. He remembered his father's hands, scarred and calloused, guiding him through the mud as a boy. "Respect the leeches," his father had said, voice low, as if the reeds themselves might overhear. "They take, yes, but they give back more than you understand. They carry life where medicine cannot. Do not fear their hunger. Fear your own ignorance." Those words echoed now, as he watched the small black bodies glide over his skin, a tiny army of healers, silent yet indispensable. Every patient who would sit in a dimly lit chamber, arm extended, pale and trembling, owed a debt to men like him, to the waiters of marshes, the unseen artisans of the body's delicate balances. The day grew colder, the sun a dull disk behind the smothering clouds. His breath rose in faint clouds, mingling with the mist, and for a moment, he felt as though the world had contracted to the span of his shoulders, the reach of his hands. Here he was both master and servant, offering his own body as a bridge between life and death. He lifted his gaze toward the distant trees, gnarled and leafless, black silhouettes against the gray. He imagined the villagers in their homes, torches flickering, children asleep, elders murmuring prayers for strength or mercy. They would never see him. They would never know the hours spent knee-deep in cold water, the relentless stings of leeches, the ache of joints numbed by wet and cold. And yet, their lives flowed smoother because of him, as blood flowed smoother under the careful ministrations of his harvest. The water surged briefly as a heron plunged, scattering shadows into dark eddies. He flinched, instinctive, and then laughed softly at himself, a sound swallowed quickly by the reeds. Solitude was both a burden and a gift. There was no one to witness his toil, no applause for the quiet heroism of endurance. But he had pride, quiet and private, a fire kindled by the knowledge that he preserved a craft few understood, fewer respected. Each scar, each mark left by the creatures he collected, was a badge of honor, a testament to his resilience and his willingness to dwell at the edge of discomfort, between fear and necessity. The sun sank lower, and the mist thickened, turning the water to liquid silver. He paused again, feeling the rhythmic tug of a leech along his forearm, and allowed himself a moment of reflection. Life, he thought, was not always grand or victorious. Sometimes, it was small and secretive, carried in the persistence of a man walking barefoot in a marsh, enduring pain so others might breathe easier, bleed less, or find solace in a healer's humble art. Every drop of blood he gathered was a prayer, a covenant with forces unseen, a subtle defiance of the chaos that lurked beyond human control. The wind whispered through the reeds, carrying scents of mud, decay, and distant smoke. He imagined the chamber of a healer, flickering with torchlight, the scent of herbs strong and pungent, a patient's pulse under careful fingers. Somewhere in that room, a hand would reach toward relief, not knowing the journey that blood had taken before it returned to comfort them. It was a sacred circle, invisible and intimate, linking marsh to chamber, leech to life, suffering to solace. He understood, in a way most never could, that healing was never simple, never clean. It was messy, demanding, and often cruel. Yet it was necessary. As twilight surrendered to night, shadows lengthening and deepening, he began the slow march back across the marsh. His skin was mottled with red dots, his body exhausted, yet his eyes glimmered with quiet triumph. The wind carried a chill that promised frost, but he welcomed it. Pain was a companion, humility a cloak, and survival a subtle victory. He traced the familiar path back, careful not to slip in the sucking mud, each step a meditation, each movement a testament to the life he chose to serve. At the edge of the marsh, where reeds met fir trees and the world seemed to exhale, he paused. He lifted his gaze skyward, where the first stars pricked the velvet dusk. In that silent communion, he allowed himself a fleeting thought of something larger than the swamp, larger than the blood he offered. Perhaps this too was a lesson, that even in the darkest, coldest, most unyielding corners of the world, there was meaning, and that small acts of endurance, small rituals of courage, could ripple outward, touching lives unseen. He waded onto firmer ground, the chill in his bones replaced by a warmth of quiet accomplishment. The marsh receded behind him like a shadow retreating at dawn, and yet its presence lingered, etched into the rhythm of his breath, the ache in his limbs, the prickle of red dots on his skin. He looked back once more at the silvered water, and in the dim light, he saw not danger, but purpose. And he knew that tomorrow he would return, wading again into the cold embrace of the marsh, a solitary guardian of a tradition older than stone, older than kings, carrying life and death together in his bare, enduring hands. Amid the morning mist that clung to the trampled fields like a shroud, the first cries of war tore through the cold air. Smoke curled from distant fires, carrying the bitter tang of iron and burning timber. Amidst this chaos, a young squire moved with deliberate precision, his hands guided by both fear and reverence. Each piece of armor he lifted was heavier than it seemed, yet the weight was not measured in metal alone. It pressed upon his shoulders like the gravity of destiny itself. The knight, his charge, stood silent and still, a monument of steel and resolve, eyes fixed on the horizon where the enemy waited, faceless yet omnipresent. The squire's fingers trembled slightly as he fitted the gorget around the knight's neck, the cold metal biting through his leather gloves. Every strap pulled tight, every hinge secured, was a prayer whispered into the chaos, a plea for endurance, for survival, for mercy. The wind carried the distant clamor of drums and horns, each beat a drum of dread in his chest. He could feel the pulse of battle in the rhythm of hammer against breastplate, the creak of chainmail under strain, the sharp edge of expectation pressing against him like a phantom. This was no ordinary labor. It was an act of devotion, a silent covenant made in the language of steel and sweat. Outside the tent flap, the field was a shifting sea of color and motion. Red banners snapped in the wind, their folds like bloodied tongues warning of the storm to come. Horses snorted and stamped, hooves churning mud into black, sticky mire. The squire's eyes darted over the expanse, cataloging threats he could not name, preparing for a violence he had only glimpsed in fevered dreams. Yet he did not flinch. Each movement of his hands, each measured breath, was a shield in itself. He was unseen, often unnoticed, yet indispensable. Without him, the night might falter. Without him, the oath they had sworn could shatter into smoke and ruin. The clang of armor on armor reverberated through the tent, a percussion of inevitability. The squire's hammer struck the last rivet into place, and for a heartbeat, the world seemed to still. He felt the heat of exertion and the chill of fear intertwine, a tangible reminder that life hung precariously in balance. Outside, the drums of war surged louder, carrying with them the scent of sweat and wet earth. The squire's thoughts turned briefly inward, to a mother's lullaby long forgotten, to a father's stern words about honor and duty. He remembered the faces of those who had fallen before him, nameless figures swallowed by the maw of battle, and he vowed silently that this knight would not join them today. The knight turned, lifting his helm, and the squire met his gaze. There was no need for words. In those eyes, he read the silent acknowledgement of trust and the weight of expectation. The battlefield was a beast that fed on hesitation and doubt. Yet here, in this moment of preparation, they were aligned against it. Each leather strap cinched, each plate adjusted, was a promise etched into steel. A pledge that one life would guard another, that one hand would steady another, that one heart would endure the terror of the storm. Outside, the first clash rang out, a distant echo of the carnage soon to consume the field. The squire's hands moved faster, almost instinctively, as if the armor itself demanded urgency. The knight flexed under the weight of the plates, muscles coiling beneath the metallic shell. The squire's fingers found the final buckle, and he paused, breath caught in his throat. This was the fulcrum of their world, the quiet moment before the storm, where every detail mattered and every second could spell life or death. As the gates of war opened, spilling men and horses into the chaos, the squire stepped back, hands stained with oil and dirt, chest heaving from exertion and apprehension. He did not join the charge. He remained a shadow behind the knight, a quiet presence on the periphery of violence. Arrows hissed overhead, and the cries of the wounded pierced the din like knives through flesh. Yet in the eye of this tempest, he was calm, vigilant, the anchor to which the night could tether his resolve. Each movement, each glance was a lifeline, a tether to the fragile thread of survival that wound them both through the storm. Hours passed like days as the battle roared and ebbed. Dust and blood mingled in a choking haze, and the squire's ears rang with the clang of steel and the groans of the fallen. Yet still he moved, unseen but indispensable, adjusting, tending, guarding. The night fought, a figure of relentless fury, but the squire's work remained, silent and steadfast, a reminder that heroism is not only in the clash of swords but in the quiet acts that sustain it. When the sun fell low, painting the battlefield in shades of fire and shadow, the fighting slowed to ragged breathing and scattered cries. Bodies lay in twisted communion with mud and blood, and the stench of death was thick enough to taste. The night, bloodied and weary, returned to where the squire waited, and for the first time in hours, their eyes met in relief and recognition. There was no triumph in their gaze, only endurance and the fragile, tremulous hope of another day. The squire helped loosen the armor, each piece sliding off like a burden released, yet the weight on his heart remained. War had passed, but the echoes lingered, invisible and insistent. In the fading light, he stood alone amidst the carnage, a sentinel among the fallen. The clang of distant bells marked the end of combat, but not of duty. He was the unseen guardian, the shadow in the periphery, the hand that steadied the sword before it struck. Tomorrow the world would call them again to the fray, and he would answer, steadfast, unwavering. For in the life of a squire, there is no glory in the sunlit day, only in the survival of those they serve, and the quiet knowledge that in their hands rests the fragile pulse of life itself. And as night descended, swallowing the field in a tapestry of dark and silver, the squire knelt, brushing the mud from his palms, whispering a prayer into the wind. The knight rested nearby, a figure carved from shadow and steel, and together, in silence, they became the memory of all that had been endured. The fires smoldered, the wind carried the scent of iron and ash, and the squire knew his journey would not end here. In every clatter of hooves, in every distant trumpet of war, he would be there unseen, unyielding, a shadow guarding the fragile flame of life against the darkness of a world that knew only blood and fire. The castle sleeps in a haze of candlelight and shadow. Corridors twist like serpents, their stones slick with the damp breath of the river beyond the walls. In this stillness, a sound breaks the silence, a soft, frantic scurrying over cold stone. The echo reverberates through the hallways, a secret drumbeat of life and decay. Here, in the dim corridors, the rat-catcher moves, body low, eyes sharp as flint. He steps lightly, a ghost among the shadows, listening, calculating. Each pause, each tilt of his head, measures the unseen enemy that spreads in silence. The rats are everywhere, yet nowhere. Their tiny claws click over worn stone, disappearing into cracks and corners, leaving only whispers of their presence. A trail of droppings, a gnawed beam, a faint rustle in the tapestry. These are the signs he follows. He kneels, examining a trap, fingertips brushing against the cold iron, feeling the weight of a responsibility most would not understand. The smell of the castle hangs heavy in the air. Damp stone, burning tallow, and beneath it, the tang of decay. Disease lingers here, unseen, patient, and he, alone, is sworn to battle it. He carries his tools like extensions of himself. Rusted iron snares, leather pouches of powdered poison, and nets woven tight enough to snatch the quickest intruder. Every piece is both weapon and risk. A single misstep, a single careless breath, and the line between hunter and hunted blurs. Yet he moves with certainty. There is no hesitation in the way he sets a trap in the shadow of a wine cellar or sprinkles powder along the hidden passage behind the kitchens. This is his kingdom, a realm ruled not by kings or knights, but by silence and the tireless pursuit of life preserved. The castle is a living thing, and he moves through its arteries with intimate knowledge. He hears the whisper of rats in the rafters as a low, urgent murmur. He feels the vibrations of tiny claws over the wooden beams beneath his knees. In the kitchens, he pauses. The cook's daughter hums a tune over a pot of stew, unaware of the tiny marauders in the corners. The boy in him, the memory of hunger, of fleas biting at the nape of his neck, stirs. He imagines the plague that could sweep through these halls if the rats were left unchecked. And he is resolved. His work is unseen, unpraised, yet indispensable. The traps spring quietly, metal snapping shut, and the soft muffled squeak fades into nothing. He checks each carefully, hands steady, eyes unwavering. Each rat caught is a victory in a war that is never truly won. The poison takes patience, knowledge, and precision. Too little and it fails, too much, and it endangers those he protects. He studies the shadows as if they are pages of a book, reading the story of infestation in every corner, every darkened archway. The air is thick with dust and the faint stench of past battles fought against vermin. He inhales, calculating, learning, planning the next move in this endless, invisible war. At times, he pauses, listening to the heartbeat of the castle, a rhythm he has come to know as well as his own. The distant clang of the blacksmith's hammer, the murmur of servants in the lower halls, the faint shuffle of a rat behind a wall, all combine into a symphony of life and death. He feels the weight of it, the precariousness of human existence tethered to fragile walls and the whims of chance. A single disease carried by a tiny creature could undo the labor of a lifetime, the safety of 100 souls. And yet he is here, unseen, the silent sentinel. Sometimes he thinks of the families he protects, the lord and lady, their children sleeping safely in feather beds. The cook scrubbing the floors without knowledge of the enemy beneath her feet. The soldiers, armored and oblivious, patrolling the outer walls. They live, laugh, eat, and dream. All because he has stalked the shadows, mapped the corners, calculated the danger. His own hunger gnaws at him, his own back aches. His own fingers blister from the toil, but none of it matters. What matters is survival, the preservation of life against a tide no one else notices. The corridors are long, the night unending. He works through the hours when the castle breathes its heaviest, when the wind rattles the shutters, and the torches flicker like nervous hearts. He sets the snares, shakes the powder, listens for the subtle shift in silence that signals movement. Every decision carries weight. Every trap must be precise. One mistake could bring disease to the kitchens, to the larder, to the nursery. Yet in his vigilance there is a strange beauty, a quiet poetry. The dance of predator and prey is ancient, eternal, and in his hands deliberate. Sometimes, when the castle sleeps most deeply, he allows himself a moment to watch. Shadows play across the walls, and in them, he imagines the world beyond stone and torchlight. Fields of wheat swaying under a sun, rivers winding like silver ribbons, children laughing, lives untouched by vermin or plague. And he holds that image close, a fragile spark that keeps his own resolve burning. He is but one man in a vast, uncaring world. Yet here, within these walls, he holds sway over life and death. He is necessary. He is guardian. He is unseen. The traps are emptied, the poison carefully gathered, and the corridors fall silent once more. Only the soft scurrying of those who escaped reminds him that the war is never done. He moves back through the castle, body weary, yet alert. The stone is cold beneath his knees, the air heavy with the scent of labor and history. Outside, the wind moans against the battlements, carrying with it the whispers of the past. Battles fought, lives lost, families protected. And in this darkness, he feels both infinitesimal and immense. The castle's heartbeat continues, steady, because he has moved among the shadows, because he has waged his quiet war. In the morning, servants will sweep the floors, nobles will rise, and the halls will echo with laughter and routine. The rat-catcher will vanish into obscurity, his work unnoticed, his name unspoken. Yet the castle remains alive, vibrant, protected. And he, finally, allows himself a small moment to rest, kneeling in a shaft of sunlight that creeps through a slit in the wall. The warmth on his skin, the faint scent of bread from the kitchens, reminds him why he endures. The unseen war continues as it always has, as it always will. But for now he has won another night. He lingers in the quiet, imagining the day ahead, the traps to set, the powder to spread, the shadows to read. The corridors whisper secrets only he can understand, and he listens, knowing that vigilance is eternal. In the dark, he is a protector, a silent sentinel, a guardian of life against the relentless tide of disease and decay. The castle sleeps, and in its heartbeat, he moves, unseen yet indispensable. And as the sun climbs higher, casting light on stone and shadow, he vanishes into the winding corridors, a ghost of duty, leaving behind only the faintest stirrings of a life preserved, a night survived, a war quietly won. A sour wind curls through the narrow streets, carrying with it the stench of the river and the tang of fermenting hides. Smoke drifts from chimneys, blurring the lines between sky and stone, and somewhere, a bell tolls, hollow and relentless. Amidst the cacophony of merchants shouting, carts rumbling over cobbles, and children's distant laughter, there is a quieter, more insistent rhythm, the rhythm of labor unyielding and unnoticed. In the shadowed courtyard of his workshop, the tanner bends over a trough of murky liquid, hands submerged to the wrists in a foul mixture of urine, lime, and water. The odor is overwhelming, yet he breathes it in as one might breathe air, for it is the air that sustains his craft. His fingers, roughened and cracked, work tirelessly at the raw hides, scraping, stretching, kneading. The hides whisper under his touch, pliant yet stubborn, responding only to pressure, patience, and repetition. Each hide is a living memory of the beast it once was, soft in some places, stiff in others, scarred, imperfect. To the untrained eye, it is simply material, foul and foul-smelling. To him, it is transformation itself. He knows every fold, every nerve, every stubborn tuft of hair. And in the darkness of early morning, when the streets are empty except for the occasional stray dog, he listens to the silence, punctuated only by the hiss of water against stone and the thump of leather against wood. The process is merciless. Hands swell, and the skin cracks, bleeding into the soapy water. The smell of decay is ever present, and yet there is an artistry here, subtle but undeniable. Leather is more than a product. It is a promise, a bridge between life and survival, between work and reward. Each boot, strap, or belt he crafts carries with it the sweat and pain of his body, the hours of his life etched into every fold. He works in solitude, yet he is not invisible. Every merchant who straps his wares, every smith who belts a sword scabbard, relies on the fruits of his labor. The town may scorn him, whispering of his trade as base and dirty, but they cannot live without it. He pauses, wiping the grime from his forehead, letting the cool morning air kiss his face, chapped and red. Around him, the town stirs more fully. The blacksmith hammers, sparks leaping like fireflies in the gray light. The baker kneads dough, fingers dusted in flour, while a child runs past, barefoot, trailing a dog that yaps and snaps at the dust. Life moves around him, yet he remains tethered to his own rhythm, to the unending task before him. Each hide submerged and lifted is a battle against rot and resistance, a negotiation with decay. He knows the smell of failure, the stench of a hide spoiled, wasted hours and lost coin. It is a smell he fears more than the pungent fumes he bathes in daily. Yet there is pride here, fierce and quiet. Pride in knowing that what he creates will endure. Boots will walk through rain and mud. Harnesses will strain against oxen. Belts will cinch armor tight to a knight's torso. His hands, though scarred and raw, shape the armor of a city, cloaks of survival, shields of the everyday. There is reverence in this labor, a silent acknowledgement of the invisible scaffolding that holds the town together. And in the rare moments when the sun pierces the gloom, falling across a half-finished hide, he sees the promise of something beautiful, supple, and ready, and for a heartbeat, he is not merely a laborer but a creator. The townsfolk may cross themselves when they see him at work, muttering prayers as if proximity to his craft were dangerous, unclean. Children are told to avert their eyes. Yet even as disdain follows him, there is a grudging dependence. For a town without leather is a town without shoes, belts, saddles, or drums. Every night, peasant and merchant carries, straps, or rides upon his unseen labor. The tanner knows he is both necessary and despised, woven into the social fabric as tightly as the threads that will one day hold his leather in a seam. Hours drag into noon. The sun beats down, thick with the scent of sweat and rot, and he feels each moment in his bones. Yet his mind drifts, as it always does, to thoughts that have nothing to do with his craft. Memories of a family lost to fever, of nights spent huddled by a hearth that smelled of ash and wet clay, of the fleeting warmth of friendship in a world so often cold. Each hide is a distraction and a meditation, a bridge between past suffering and present endurance. In the repetitive motion of scraping and stretching, he finds a rhythm, a song without words, a hymn to resilience. By late afternoon, the workshop is a cathedral of scents and shadows. Hides hang on racks, some smooth and pale, some dark and stubbornly rough, ready for the next stage of tanning, the next transformation. He steps back, shoulders aching, palms blistered and bleeding, and surveys his work. There is a satisfaction here that no coin can buy, a quiet pride in mastery over a cruel and demanding material. Each piece is a testament to perseverance, to skill honed through suffering, to the unseen sacrifices of a life bound to labor. Even as dusk approaches, he does not rest. The town quiets. Candles flicker in windows, casting trembling shadows on cobblestones. Somewhere, a bell tolls again, distant and hollow. He moves to the last hide of the day, a stubborn piece, twisted and resistant. His hands shake, but he works, whispering under his breath, cajoling the skin to yield. The night draws in, thick and heavy, and with it comes the cold bite of wind that slips through cracks in doors and windows. Yet the tanner persists, fingers raw, eyes stinging, heart steady. For he knows that survival is built on such persistence, on labor that is invisible, unglamorous, and relentless. Finally, when the last hide is set aside, he steps back into the gray dusk. The town is hushed now, the market stalls empty, the streets slick with evening rain. A lantern glows faintly in the doorway, casting a circle of warmth, but beyond that, shadows stretch long and thin. He breathes in the cold air, savoring the brief respite, feeling the ache in his muscles as proof of a day survived and a craft maintained. In this silence, he understands the true weight of his work, not in gold or praise, but in the quiet endurance that holds a community together. He closes the workshop door gently, knowing tomorrow will demand the same, the unending cycle of labor, smell, and skill. Yet even in this relentless routine, there is dignity, a quiet poetry that few can see or appreciate. Each hide is a story of transformation, each scar on his hand a testament to survival, each foul odor a reminder that life's necessities are rarely clean or easy. He walks into the fogged streets, blending into the muted chorus of the town, carrying with him the invisible legacy of his craft. And in the dark, as torches gutter and the wind whispers through alleys, the tanner's work remains, a silent, enduring presence. It is in the boots that will tread tomorrow's mud, the harnesses that will strain against burdened oxen, the belts that will cinch the armor of knights. The town sleeps unaware, yet he has shaped its very skin. The night enfolds him, cold and impartial, and still, he endures, a quiet master of transformation, a sentinel of survival, a witness to the invisible heart of the medieval world. A thick, unnatural silence hung over the streets, broken only by the occasional groan that slipped from a window, muffled by shudders and fear. The air smelled of rot and damp cloth, and every footstep stirred the scent, sharp and metallic, clinging to the nose like a warning. He moved slowly, deliberately, each hand gloved and wrapped, each breath measured, as though the very act of living could betray him. Around him, the city had become a necropolis. Alleys were littered with bodies stacked like fallen soldiers, their faces frozen in silent terror, their hands grasping nothing but air. The plague had claimed all, and yet life, or what remained of it, persisted only in the shadows, in the hush of abandoned homes and shuttered doors. He knelt beside the first corpse, a woman whose hair, dark and matted, was stuck to the sweat and blood on her forehead. His gloved fingers brushed against her cold cheek, and for a fleeting heartbeat, he imagined her breathing, imagined the life she had carried within her chest, now gone. Her eyes were open, staring, accusing, pleading, but he could not linger. The task demanded speed, ritual, and an unbroken resolve. One wrong move, one slip, and the invisible enemy would claim him too. He lifted her with a practiced motion, the weight of her body pulling at his shoulders, and carried her toward the cart waiting in the square, the wooden wheels creaking against cobblestones wet with rain and decay. The streets were eerily empty, but not lifeless. Rats scuttled among the gutters, their tiny claws clicking against stone as they feasted on what humans had abandoned. The wind whispered through the chimneys and gables, carrying with it fragments of prayers, curses, and cries that seemed to belong to another world. He imagined the city's people hiding behind walls, behind the trembling hope that they might survive another day, and he felt the burden of being the bridge between them and the dead. He was a sentinel in a world unmade, a keeper of the threshold between the living and the forgotten. The work was never-ending. Another body, another stretch of cobbled street lined with shadowed doorways. A child, perhaps no more than 7 winters old, lay on the ground, its small body unnaturally still, lips blue, fingers curled as if in mid-reach for something lost. He swallowed a sudden ache, a tide of grief threatening to crush him, and whispered something he did not fully hear himself repeat. A prayer, a plea, or a remembrance. He wrapped the child in a rough cloth, securing it with a care he did not extend to himself. Each motion was ritual, each placement in the cart a sacred act of witness. He did not mourn openly. He could not. Mourning too loudly was a luxury the plague had stripped from him, from everyone. Yet in the solitude of his task, grief became a companion, a presence as constant as the stench and the shadow of death. The city itself seemed to recoil from him, its walls darkened by soot, its windows staring blankly like eyes that had seen too much. A bell tolled in the distance, hollow and slow, marking an hour none remembered, none cared to remember. His boots left prints in the mud, tiny marks that vanished in the next minute beneath the falling rain. For a moment, he paused, breathing through the mask of cloth and leather, feeling the rhythm of his heart pounding against his ribs. He was alive, a fact that was both victory and curse. Each heartbeat was a reminder of what he could not share with the dead, and each step forward was a defiance against the certainty that surrounded him. By mid-afternoon, the cart was full. Bodies swayed gently as he walked, suspended between the living and the earth, a procession for no one to see. He reached the graveyard, the gates twisted and blackened by time, the stones pale and weathered, etched with names that once sang with laughter. He unfastened the cart, rolling it carefully along the uneven path, every creak of wood a drumbeat of inevitability. As he lifted each corpse, he felt the life that had once been, imagined the warmth, the breath, the pulse that had filled their days. And as he laid them into the shallow graves, the earth sucking them into its cold embrace, he whispered the names aloud, names he may never have known, names he was learning now in the act of letting go. The sun began to dip, casting long shadows across the cemetery. Mist crawled across the graves like a living thing, softening the edges of stone and soil, merging the dead into the landscape of the night. He paused, leaning on his spade, and looked over the rows of unmarked earth. The graves filled not with the stories of kings or knights, but with nameless souls, each as vibrant, as loved, as mourned in life as any who had ever drawn a sword or worn a crown. He imagined the city behind him, houses shuttered, families huddled, and understood that his work, grim and lonely, was the hinge upon which survival balanced. Without him, the dead would choke the streets, the living would lose even the faintest thread of hope. A crow cawed from a twisted branch, startling him, and for a heartbeat, he was tempted to think it a messenger, a harbinger of the next wave of loss. He shook the thought away, focusing instead on the rhythm of the work. Dig, lift, lay, cover, each movement a prayer, each pause a reflection of what it meant to witness so much without faltering. He imagined the city remembering him one day, not as a hero, not as a savior, but as the one who held the balance, who kept the shadow at bay with nothing but determination and ritual, with the quiet courage of facing what no one else could endure. Night fell, and with it a cold that seeped into bones. He worked by lantern light, the small flames flickering against the pale faces of the dead. Sometimes he thought he saw movement in the corner of his vision, only to realize it was his own reflection in wet stones, a reminder that he was still here, still breathing, still tasked with this impossible duty. He whispered to himself, soft and unsteady, a promise to the dead that they would not be forgotten, a promise to the living that someone still walked among the shadows, ensuring that the city, fragile and trembling, could persist another day. Finally, the last grave was filled. He stood alone among the freshly turned earth, the night wrapping around him like a shroud. The wind carried a scent of rain and ash, a mixture of ending and beginning. He closed his eyes, feeling the weight of every soul he had touched, every story he had preserved in the act of letting go. In that silence, broken only by the distant echo of the city that still breathed beyond the gates, he understood that his work was more than survival. It was remembrance. It was honor. It was the quiet defiance of life against an enemy that sought to erase all. He turned back toward the streets, toward the city that slept uneasily behind its walls, carrying with him the unspoken truth of the plague, that death, though relentless, could be met with devotion, that in the face of unending loss, one could still choose duty, compassion, and the solemn act of memory. The first lanterns flickered in the windows, shadows dancing as if in silent tribute. And as he walked back into the darkened streets, the rhythm of his footsteps was a steady heartbeat against the chaos, a promise that the dead were not abandoned, and that the living, however fragile, still had a guardian in the plague-buried streets of the city. The bell tower loomed above the town like a sentinel carved in stone, its shadow stretching over narrow streets slick with rain and mud. In the flickering light of a single torch, the bell ringer's silhouette moved with the precision of a ritual, his hands gripping the coarse ropes as though they were extensions of his own body. Each rope pulled was a tether to the past, to centuries of tradition, to a life that had been carved from sweat and risk. The bells trembled, groaning at first, then rising to a deep, resonant chorus that echoed across rooftops, through alleys, and into the hearts of those below. Their sound was more than a call. It was the town's heartbeat, a rhythm that punctuated prayers, warnings, feasts, and funerals alike. The wind clawed at the tower, tugging at the ropes, hissing through the stone crenellations. From this height, the streets below seemed fragile, like a map traced on fragile parchment. And yet the town relied upon this man, his vigilance stitched into the fabric of every life beneath him. Each toll carried a warning and a comfort simultaneously, a reminder that time passed relentlessly and that life, in all its chaos, required structure. He was unseen but omnipresent. The town would not stir without the tolling of the bells, and he, suspended above them all, bore the responsibility with an almost sacred devotion. The work was grueling, a test of endurance and nerve. His hands were scarred, the calluses thick and unyielding, skin split in several places from friction and age. The ropes bit into his palms, cords of hemp slicing like knives when the bell resisted. Muscles in his arms and back strained with each swing. His breath ragged as if the very air of the tower were thinner than life itself. Yet he did not falter. Even when dizziness threatened, when vertigo twisted the world beneath him into a dizzying swirl, he remained anchored to the stone floor, to the ropes, to the sacred rhythm of the bells. Each pull, each toll was a covenant between him and the town, between the living and the dead, between the fleeting moment and eternity. The tower itself seemed alive, groaning and shifting with the weight of its own history. Moss clung to cracks in the stone, and centuries of wind had hollowed the floors, making every step a perilous gamble. Chains rattled with each swing of the bells, metal striking stone in a sound both alarming and beautiful, echoing like distant thunder. The ringer knew the danger intimately. A slip, a misstep, a sudden jolt of the rope could send him plunging into darkness. Yet danger was never merely a threat. It was the rhythm of existence here. To live meant to confront risk, to embrace it as part of daily devotion. And so he climbed higher, pulled harder, and never allowed fear to quiet the bell's voice. From below, the townspeople paused to listen. Merchants with dirt-caked hands lifted heads from their stalls. Mothers hushed children mid-cry, and the old prayed with eyes closed, imagining the pealing sound like a bridge from their small lives to the heavens above. To them, the bell was a guardian, invisible yet present. It spoke of hours of work, of prayers at dawn, of meals and rest, of sorrow and celebration. Yet none could imagine the terror and grace of the tower itself, the peril woven into each note, the symphony of strain and endurance that resided entirely in one man's shoulders. He was a silent witness to the town's every triumph and every tragedy, bound by ropes and stone to a fate few would understand. Sometimes, when the wind shrieked and clouds gathered in roiling gray masses above, the bell ringer's thoughts drifted. He imagined the countless predecessors who had held these same ropes, who had known the same weight, the same risk, the same sacred duty. Perhaps, he thought, the bells remembered them, each note a memory cast into the air. Their voices joined his, a chorus of past and present, of flesh and metal, of devotion that transcended mortality. In these moments, time felt suspended. Seconds stretched into eternity, and he understood, as clearly as any priest in a candlelit chapel, that his life was a prayer made manifest in sound and motion. And yet, there were moments of raw fear. A rope could snap without warning, a floorboard could crumble underfoot, or the bell's swing could knock him into oblivion. He had seen colleagues vanish, lost to a moment's distraction, a single lapse of attention. The memory of their faces haunted him, ghostly images dancing in the torchlight, a warning written in flesh and echo. Each toll, then, was also a defiance of that mortality, a declaration that he would continue, that life persisted, that the town's rhythm would not falter. He pulled with all his strength, chanting silently, a prayer carried on his breath and arms, and the bells roared in answer, defiant and eternal. In the still hours of dawn, when mist curled around the tower like fingers of the unseen, he paused briefly. The town slept beneath him, unaware of the danger and devotion high above their heads. A crow cawed from a distant roof. A cat's soft paw steps sounded on wet shingles. In that pause, the ringer felt the pulse of the world. Fragile, fleeting, yet connected in a rhythm that he alone upheld. His hands, bleeding, trembling, bore the story of countless hours, of lives intertwined with stone and rope and bronze. And when he resumed, pulling again, each toll was an act of continuity, of persistence, of faith in the unseen thread that binds a community together. The sound of the bells faded with the day, rolling through the streets like a retreating tide, leaving the town to its routines, its labors, its feasts, and its grief. But the ringer's presence lingered in that resonance, in the memory of the vibrations underfoot, in the echo that settled into hearts and walls alike. He descended the tower only when the final toll faded, muscles quivering, hands slick with blood and sweat, heart still racing with the effort and the fear. Yet even as he stepped onto the solid ground, the connection remained unbroken. The town and the tower, the living and the dead, time and memory, all bound by the tolling of a bell and the devotion of one solitary man. And in that fading light, as the torch sputtered and wind whispered through the stones, he lifted his gaze once more to the towering structure, knowing the cycle would begin again tomorrow. The ropes would bite, the bells would sing, the wind would howl, but he would climb, pull, endure. For the tower was more than stone and metal. It was a testament, a voice, a heartbeat. And he, though small against the vast sky, was the keeper of its song, the silent guardian whose life echoed in every toll. The bell's voice carried on, fading into the distance, a bridge between what had been and what was yet to come, leaving the town in quiet awe, unknowing of the peril and poetry suspended above them, waiting for the next pull, the next toll, the next moment of transcendence.